No one expected a line like that to be uttered in the middle of a congressional hearing, but there it was, clear, cold, delivered without a flicker of doubt. A former white attorney general looking directly at a black congresswoman and saying, "Maybe you should go back to Africa." The air in the room froze. No laughter, no objections, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from shock, but from a collective realization that something sacred had been violated. It wasn't just a breach of decorum, it was a jagged, ugly truth that had long been buried in polite conversation. Pam Bondi sat there, her hands folded neatly, her gaze colder than steel. She didn't flinch, she didn't stutter. This wasn't a slip of the tongue, it was calculated, a line fired like a bullet. There was no hesitation in her voice, no apology in her posture. She had spent her life surrounded by power, using her words and presence to command any room. To her, this was a strike, a way to seize the narrative before it slipped away. But across from her, Jasmine Crockett didn't react. She didn't raise her hand or offer a rebuttal. She sat still, like a statue carved from granite. In her eyes, there was no rage, no visible pain, only a focused, unwavering calm. She wasn't there to weigh Pam's words. She was there to measure their impact, not just on herself, but on the millions watching. Jasmine knew she wouldn't answer with a shout. She would answer with evidence, with history, with truths buried deep in dusty files no one wanted to read. A black folder sat silently on the table before her. No one else knew what it contained, but she did. Inside was a bomb, not the kind that explodes in sound and fury, but the kind that brings down walls, built from prejudice and silence. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't need to. Truth doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs the right moment to be spoken. And that moment was coming. That morning in Washington had seemed unremarkable. A pale grey sky hung low over the city. A light breeze rustled the iron fences around the Capitol. Inside Hearing Room 4A, however, something felt different. The gallery seats had filled before dawn. Even those lining the hallways stood silent, not gossiping like usual. Everyone sensed it. Something was about to happen. Cameras had been positioned, microphones tested, but no one was looking at the equipment. All eyes were fixed on the two chairs in the center of the room, where two women were about to face each other. Pam Bondi wore a deep navy suit, her posture straight as steel, her eyes unwavering. She arrived 30 minutes early, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. She had once occupied rooms where a single nod from her could overrule entire testimonies, but today she wasn't giving orders. Today she was answering them. Her calm was an old armor, polished by years of power and privilege, but beneath it, something had begun to shift the moment she learned Jasmine would be the one questioning her. It wasn't because Jasmine was a congresswoman. It was because she carried something Pam couldn't control: memory. Jasmine entered without aids or pleasantries, her gaze direct and unwavering. She had stood in courtrooms where even the sound of breathing could feel like testimony. But this was a different kind of battle. Here they didn't shout to manipulate. They used cold language and prestigious titles to justify injustice. Jasmine brought none of that. She brought silence. The kind of silence that makes the person across from you feel seen too deeply. Pam didn't retreat. She sat upright, hands clasped, eyes steady, trying to treat this hearing like just another footnote in her long career. But what she didn't realize was that her dismissal of this moment would be the very reason she would never forget it. They didn't smile. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. Neither of them came to perform. One came to testify. The other came to be forced to listen. On Jasmine's table, the black folder still lay untouched. She hadn't opened it. No one else knew what it contained. But in her posture, there was a promise. Once it opened, no one in that room would remain the same, not because she threatened them, but because she carried something more powerful than threats, the truth, fear, the most truthful thing in the room. With every documented word, the air thickened. A translator adjusted the mic. A clerk flipped open their notebook. Some lawmakers pretended to check their notes, but no one was really paying attention. They weren't waiting for testimony. They were waiting for a collision, and none of them expected that the first blow would come from Pam. The chair of the hearing gave a light rap of the gavel, and the room seemed to cinch tight, like a rope pulled to breaking. Red lights blinked on the cameras. Reporters leaned forward, frames adjusted, as if they were about to witness history. Lawmakers shifted in their seats, bracing themselves for the first cut. Jasmine began speaking in a voice that was low, steady, and sure. No tremble, no hint of hesitation. She didn't read from notes. She spoke as if every word had been seared into memory. No excess, no flourish. And when she reached the phrase, "a justice system that fails people of color," Pam Bondi leaned toward her mic. She didn't wait for Jasmine to finish. Her voice was smooth, glacial, cut from ice. She didn't need to raise it. Each word fell into place with precision, deliberate and cold. "Maybe instead of lecturing America on justice," she said, "you should return to Africa and relearn your roots." The words didn't drop to the floor. They froze the air. The room fell still. A young black aide turned his head. A female journalist's coffee cup paused at her lips. No one laughed. No one moved. The silence didn't beg for words. It braced for an eruption. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't lean back. She didn't even blink. She didn't ask for clarification, didn't dignify the question. She sat, posture straight, hands steady, and fixed her eyes on Pam. It wasn't rage in her look. It was something far more unsettling, pure, unwavering focus, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what she was there to do. Pam, still composed, felt the shift in the room. No one leapt to her defense, no friendly nods from her usual allies. Even the conservative senators said nothing. Her words had cut, not because they were sharp, but because they were true. They exposed the one thing everyone tiptoed around. That bias wasn't written into law, it was written into the bloodstream of the system itself. Jasmine's voice finally broke the silence. No shouting, no sarcasm, just a calm, measured, "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" It wasn't a question, it was a verdict, a final, unwritten indictment that no one in the room could deny. There was no talking around it now. It had been said, broadcast live, documented. No one could pretend it hadn't happened. No one could erase it. Pam felt every pair of eyes turn her way. She looked around for support, but saw only distance. Hands that once patted her shoulder now clutched armrests. One lawmaker looked away. Another seemed on the edge of leaving. No one would protect her. In that moment, Pam realized she'd gone too far. Jasmine still hadn't touched the folder. She didn't need to. Memories rose in her mind. Memories of lives in courtrooms, of names never called, of sentences that weighed heavier on dark skin. And now, one of the architects of that machinery sat across from her and dared to say she didn't belong. Jasmine didn't rise with anger. She rose with certainty. She stood so that no one in that room, no one in power, could leave untouched by the truth. The scrape of her chair on the marble floor was quiet, but in the stillness of the room, it sounded like a shot. She didn't glance at Pam. She didn't seek out allies. She stepped forward into the center of the hearing floor as if it had always been hers. Each step was deliberate, every movement an assertion that this was her ground. Pam watched her, the confidence in her eyes flickering. Her hands were clenched tighter now, shoulders taut as the first cracks formed beneath the surface. Jasmine stopped in the center. She opened the black folder in her hands. The dossier had the seal of the Department of Justice and a red slanted stamp. Confidential. No narration, no dramatics. The cover alone made it clear. This wasn't testimony. It was federal documentation, written while Pam Bondi was in office. Jasmine didn't perform. She wasn't there to lecture. She didn't need to play prosecutor or professor. She simply turned to the first tabbed page, scanned a dense chart, then looked up at Pam. Her voice was steady and cold as honed steel. According to internal analysis by the Florida Department of Justice in 2018, black defendants were sentenced to prison an average of 32% longer than white defendants for the same charges. The words didn't thunder, but they struck like a hammer, cleaving through the final illusion of fairness in the room. Pam was frozen. She didn't object, didn't deny. She just sat there, unmoving, unblinking. Jasmine turned the page. Her finger landed on a red sticky note. Prosecutorial review suggests that charges were more frequently escalated when the defendant's name had African or Latino phonetics, not based on evidence, not on behavior. Just the name. A cold wave swept through the chamber. This was no longer about implicit bias. This was systemic, documented, executed, and now read aloud to the entire country. Jasmine continued, "No rush, no tremor. Page 47, wrongful arrests. 87% occurred in neighborhoods predominantly black or Latino. Fewer than 5% received formal apologies. None received financial compensation." Pam bowed her head for just a moment. No one else noticed, but Jasmine did. For the first time, Pam showed a crack, no guilt, just the exhaustion of exposure. No lawyers to shield her, no spokespeople to twist her words. Everything laid bare, every number, every annotation, every trace of injustice, signed off during her tenure. Jasmine turned to a near-final page. She paused longer this time. Her finger slid beneath a faint orange highlight, an internal note penned by Pam's senior legal advisor. "There is pressure from leadership to be tougher on minority suspects, particularly during election years, to maintain base voter support." No one spoke, no one coughed, no one blinked. Pam sat there, her eyes glassy, as if the air had been pulled from her lungs, not because she'd been exposed, but because there was nothing left to cling to. The truth was no longer up for debate. It was printed, read aloud, entered into public record. No apology could erase it. Jasmine closed the folder softly, like sealing a coffin. She didn't look at Pam. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, silent. But in that silence rang something louder than any speech. No satisfaction, no sorrow, only the quiet resolve of someone who had laid the truth bare and let the rest reveal itself. No one spoke as Jasmine returned to her seat. Those who had hidden behind silence now found themselves awkward within it. It was no longer a silence of protocol. It was the silence of those who had just witnessed something undeniable. The numbers, the excerpts, the evidence, read not as a threat, but as a verdict that needed no jury. Then the room began to turn. All eyes drifted back to Pam Bondi. Not to hear a rebuttal, only to see what she would do now that the mask of moral authority had been stripped away. Pam sat still. The pages Jasmine had read seemed to hover in the air before her. Each line, each figure, tapping cold fingers against the shell she'd built in her mind. She couldn't recall who sat to her right. She couldn't hear the reporters flipping their notepads. She couldn't feel the floor beneath her feet. Then a memory surfaced, uninvited, years old. She saw herself as a young law student, exhausted, proud, still green. A summer night, pulled aside by campus security for parking in the wrong spot. An unopened bottle of wine in the back seat. It could have cost her everything, but Marcus Daniels, a black classmate, not even a close friend, had stepped in, spoken a few calm words, and the moment. Pam had never spoken of it. She buried that memory beneath career ambition, beneath speeches about law, order, and moral clarity. But now, in this hearing, that memory returned like a ghost, not to accuse her, but to illuminate. For the first time in years, Pam felt small, not because someone else diminished her, but because she saw the part of herself she had long ago buried, the part that had once been saved by the very people she later chose to ignore. In the halls of Congress, reporters' phones rang non-stop. Newsrooms clipped Jasmine's speech and launched it online. No edits, no music, just a black woman standing steady, documents in hand, voice calm and unwavering. The video went viral. On Twitter, they didn't argue party lines, they spoke of justice. On TikTok, law students added captions and commentary. On Instagram, mothers shared the clip of Jasmine recalling ancestors who had been chained and sold, but who had stayed and believed in something bigger than themselves. Back in her Florida home, Pam returned. She didn't turn on the TV. She didn't speak. She sat in a worn armchair by the window, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. On her open laptop, the cursor blinked at an unfinished sentence. Not a statement, not a press release, just a few hesitant words that began with, "I'm sorry." Then she erased them, not because she didn't feel remorse, but because she didn't know where to begin. She had believed she was right for 20 years, and now she sat in a room filled with sunlight, seeing shadows everywhere. Jasmine said, nothing more. She didn't need to. What needed to be said had been said. What needed to be heard was already echoing across the country. She hadn't come to win. She hadn't come to destroy Pam. She came to show the country the painting. The system had drawn in silence for too long, and in that very silence the story changed. No one demanded Pam's resignation. No charges were read aloud. But in the eyes of the public, her moral authority was gone, permanently. The cost of truth wasn't punishment. It was this. There was no more pretending. There was nowhere left to hide, no words left to disguise it, only yourself. And sometimes yourself is the heaviest verdict of all. There was no official statement from Congress, no public apology from Pam Bondi. But her silence, once a shield, became the quietest admission the country had ever seen. Social media didn't demand her resignation. There were no protests, no banners, just a share button, millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments, and a video under 2 minutes long spread like a moral lesson faster than any piece of legislation. Jasmine didn't go on talk shows. She didn't appear on magazine covers. She turned down exclusive interviews. She went to work like always, showed up on time, listened to constituents who emailed her office. But something had shifted. People began to stop her in hallways, not for autographs, but to nod. A retired soldier shook her hand in an elevator and whispered, "I used to think we couldn't change anything, but that day, you made me quiet for the first time." A law student wrote her a handwritten letter saying he'd never seen someone, read documents in a way that made people cry. She didn't reply to every message, but she read them all. In classrooms, teachers began showing the clip. No edits, no music. Just the moment Jasmine spoke of her ancestors, not choosing to come, but being dragged, beaten, sold, and still believing in something bigger. Students were silent. One asked, why wasn't she angry? Another clutched a notebook as if, for the first time, they understood that injustice isn't just in textbooks. It breathes in every unspoken word. As for Pam, she all but disappeared from public life. Her office declined every interview request. No response video, no written statement. Even those who once praised her no longer dared to say her name. In her beachside home, sunlight poured through the window onto her face, but it couldn't chase away what she now had to live with. She reopened the video. No fast forward, no mute. This time she didn't watch to argue, but to understand. In Jasmine's eyes, she saw herself, not as a victim, but as someone finally brave enough to confront the truth she had long buried beneath titles and polite silence. She opened her laptop. Not to craft an apology, but to reread the report Jasmine had quoted, page 47, wrongful arrest. The numbers weren't just statistics anymore. They were families. They were names she had never spoken aloud in all her speeches. Now she couldn't look away. Jasmine didn't care for apologies that arrived too late. What mattered to her was that this time her words hadn't fallen into a void. She didn't want applause. She wasn't seeking power. She had always wanted a response. And for the first time, she felt the truth wasn't just heard. It was remembered, not because it shocked people, but because it touched something they could no longer deny. In a small classroom in Mississippi, a teacher played the clip. There wasn't much discussion afterward. A boy whispered, "She didn't shout, but I still heard her." And in the teacher's quiet nod, something was affirmed. From that moment on, silence would no longer be an option. Not in classrooms, not in courtrooms, not in Congress. No one stripped Pam of her titles. No one crowned Jasmine with new ones. But the public, in its profound silence, drew a clear line. Who had shifted the room's direction? Who had made a nation pause long enough to see itself again? Jasmine's story didn't end when she walked out of that hearing room. It didn't end at the millionth view, or with the final trending hashtag. It continued quietly, persistently, in small classrooms, at family dinner tables, in local council meetings. No more stage lights, no more microphones. But the hush that followed was the clearest sign that something had been remembered. No one asked Jasmine if she felt like she'd won, because in a hearing like that, there are no winners. She hadn't defeated anyone. She had simply said what generations before her had been denied the chance to say, and she had done what many thought impossible. She made a nation listen without ever having to scream. A father posted a video of himself watching Jasmine's speech with his son. No monologue, no applause, just a shared glance between two generations. The child didn't fully understand the meaning, but he saw his father's eyes tremble. In that moment, something sacred passed from one heart to another, beyond party lines and into a quiet understanding that truth, spoken at the right moment, can be mightier than any argument. Jasmine didn't need to write another word to justify herself. Those who had once stayed silent were now writing for her. A single mother shared the video with the caption, "Not because it made me angry, but because it made me lift my head." A veteran wrote beneath the clip, "No one ever taught me that silence could be this powerful." And an 8th grade girl wrote in her civics essay, "If I could choose anyone to be my teacher, I'd choose her." No one remembers the exact title of the hearing, but everyone remembers Jasmine's face, standing at the center of that room, unshielded and unafraid, folder in hand, eyes fixed on the woman who once believed she had the power to decide who belonged. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for everything that had been forgotten, everything that had been buried beneath handshakes and closed doors. She didn't shout, she didn't perform, she simply stood. And that was enough to change everything. For those still asking what they can do in a world so full of injustice, the answer doesn't lie in banners or speeches. It lies in one simple act, showing up, not retreating, not bowing your head. And when it's your turn to speak, to do so with a voice that does not tremble, with eyes that do not look away. Jasmine did her part. Now it's your turn. The question is no longer what Jasmine will do next. The question is, what will you do after hearing her? And if you've been waiting for a moment to begin, maybe this is it.